Ray Jensen never expected much from life anymore. At 56, he'd buried his wife, scaled back his dreams, and settled into the quiet rhythm of his small-town garage, where he restored classic cars and cared for his special needs son. The work was honest, the days predictable, and that seemed like enough. Then Vivian Hale's midnight blue Mustang rolled into his life on a Tuesday afternoon, its engine knocked out and its owner stranded far from her billionaire world. She was 60, silver-haired, and used to fixing problems with phone calls and checkbooks. But some things can't be rushed, not vintage engines, not broken hearts, and certainly not the slow miracle of two people learning to trust again. Over weeks of waiting for parts and sharing coffee, they discovered something neither expected to find. What happens when a woman who has everything meets a man who's lost it all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the quiet of Ray Jensen's bedroom at 5:30 sharp, same as it had every morning for the past 3 years. He reached across the empty space where Sarah used to sleep and silenced it with the practiced motion of a man who'd learned to navigate solitude. The gold wedding band on his finger caught the first hint of dawn filtering through the curtains, a worn circle of metal that had become as much a part of him as breathing. Ray's feet found the cold hardwood floor, and he shuffled toward the kitchen, muscle memory guiding him through the familiar routine. Coffee first, always coffee. The ancient Mr. Coffee Machine Sarah had insisted on keeping despite his offers to upgrade it gurgled to life, filling the small kitchen with the rich aroma that marked the beginning of another day. While the coffee brewed, Ray padded down the hallway to check on Danny. His son's door stood slightly ajar, as it had since Danny was a child afraid of the dark. At 28, Danny still needed the comfort of knowing his father was nearby, still required the gentle rhythms and predictable patterns that made his world feel safe. Danny lay curled beneath his favorite quilt, the one Sarah had made with vintage car patches when he was 12. His dark hair, so much like his mother's, fell across his forehead in sleep. Ray watched the steady rise and fall of his son's breathing, felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with the fierce protectiveness of being Danny's only anchor in a world that didn't always understand him. "Morning, buddy," Ray whispered, though he knew Danny wouldn't wake for another hour. The routine mattered, even if no one else heard it. Back in the kitchen, Ray poured his coffee into the chipped mug Danny had made him in high school ceramics class. The handle was slightly lopsided, the glaze uneven, but it held heat and had been crafted with love, two qualities Ray valued above perfection. Through the window above the sink, he could see Jensen's classic car restoration across the gravel driveway. The building had been a barn once, back when this property housed actual livestock instead of mechanical beasts. Ray had converted it himself 15 years ago, back when Sarah was still alive to bring him sandwiches and complain about the noise. Now it stood silent in the morning light, waiting for him to breathe life into its shadows. Ray's coffee was still steaming when he heard the familiar sounds of Danny stirring the creak of bed springs, the soft thud of feet hitting the floor, the gentle humming that meant his son was ready to face the day. These sounds had become Ray's second alarm clock, more reliable than any manufactured timepiece. "Dad?" Danny's voice carried down the hallway, tinged with the slight uncertainty that always marked his first moments of consciousness. "Kitchen, Danny. Coffee's ready." Danny appeared in the doorway, wearing his favorite T-shirt faded blue with a 1967 Camaro SS emblazoned across the front. His hair stuck up at odd angles, and he wore the slightly dazed expression of someone still negotiating the transition from sleep to wakefulness. "What day is it?" Danny asked, though he knew. This question was part of his morning ritual, a way of organizing his thoughts and preparing for what lay ahead. "Tuesday, son. Parts delivery day." Danny's face brightened. He loved parts delivery day, loved the anticipation of seeing what treasures Tom Bradley might bring in his cluttered truck. Danny had an almost supernatural ability to remember part numbers, specifications, and compatibility details that Ray sometimes forgot. It was one of the many ways his son's mind worked differently, and better than most people's. They ate breakfast together at the small kitchen table, the same table where Ray and Sarah had shared thousands of meals. Danny methodically worked through his scrambled eggs and toast, cutting everything into precise squares before eating. Ray had learned long ago not to comment on these rituals, understanding that they brought Danny comfort in a world that often felt chaotic. Mrs. Chun said she might have apple turnovers today, Danny mentioned between bites. Mrs. Chun lived next door and had appointed herself as Danny's unofficial grandmother after Sarah's death. She brought baked goods twice a week and always remembered Danny's favorites. "That's nice, buddy. Maybe you can help me organize the intake forms today. Tom's bringing parts for 3 different jobs." Danny nodded enthusiastically. Organization was his specialty, one of the ways he contributed meaningfully to the garage's operation. Ray had learned to value his son's methodical approach to cataloging parts, maintaining inventory, and ensuring nothing got lost in the controlled chaos of restoration work. After breakfast, they walked across the gravel together, Ray's longer stride automatically adjusting to match Danny's more measured pace. The morning air carried the scent of honeysuckle from Sarah's garden, which Ray still maintained, though he'd never had her green thumb. Some things were too important to let die, even if they required more effort than he could easily spare. Ray unlocked the garage's heavy wooden door and stepped into his sanctuary. The space smelled of motor oil, metal polish, and the indefinable scent of time and patience. Classic cars in various stages of restoration filled the Bay Areas. A 1967 Camaro SS that was nearly complete, a 1970 Plymouth Cuda that still needed extensive engine work, and a 1965 Ford Mustang coupe that had arrived the previous week with rust damage and a seized engine. The Mustang belonged to Harold Wickham, a retired teacher who'd been saving for 5 years to restore his father's car. Ray had quoted him a fair price, knowing Harold's budget was tight, but understanding the emotional value of the project. Some restorations weren't about money. They were about preserving memories, maintaining connections to people who mattered. Danny immediately gravitated toward the parts organization area, where he'd created a system of labeled bins, cross-referenced inventory sheets, and color-coded tracking forms. Ray watched his son work with the kind of focused intensity that made him forget about the rest of the world. In these moments, Danny's differences became advantages, his attention to detail transforming into a superpower that kept the garage running smoothly. Ray approached the Camaro, running his hands along the freshly painted fender. The car belonged to Jim Morrison, not the famous singer, but a local insurance agent who'd been restoring it for his upcoming retirement. Ray had been working on it for 8 months, and it was nearly ready for its final inspection. The engine purr had been perfect during yesterday's test drive. The transmission shifted smoothly, and the interior work was complete. The satisfaction of bringing a classic car back to life never grew old. Each restoration was a small resurrection, a chance to honor the craftsmanship of earlier generations, while creating something that would outlast the people who built it. Ray understood that he was part of a continuum, connecting past and future through the patient work of his hands. His phone buzzed with a text from Tom Bradley. "Running late. Truck trouble. Be there by noon." Ray smiled and showed the message to Danny, who immediately adjusted his mental schedule. Flexibility within routine was something they'd both learned to navigate over the years. "Want to work on the Mustang while we wait?" Ray asked. Danny nodded, already reaching for his clipboard and pen. They'd developed a system where Danny documented each step of the restoration process, creating detailed records that helped Ray track progress and provided invaluable reference material for future jobs. Ray lifted the Mustang's hood and stared at the seized engine. The previous owner had attempted some repairs that had created more problems than they solved. Getting this engine running again would require patience, skill, and probably some parts that weren't easy to find. But that was the nature of restoration. Work solving puzzles that seemed impossible until you understood the logic behind them. As Ray began disassembling the engine, Danny narrated each step into his recorder, creating an audio log that would help them remember exactly what they'd done. It was Danny's idea, this system of documentation, and it had proven invaluable during complex restorations. The morning passed quietly, father and son working together in the comfortable silence of shared purpose. Ray removed the engine's cylinder head while Danny carefully labeled and organized each component. The work was methodical, almost meditative, requiring the kind of attention that pushed other worries to the background. At 11:30, Ray heard tires on gravel and looked up to see an unfamiliar car approaching. Not Tom's parts truck, but a sleek black sedan with tinted windows. The car moved slowly, as if the driver was uncertain about the location. "Expecting someone?" Danny asked, following his father's gaze. "Nope, probably someone looking for directions." The sedan parked near the garage entrance, and Ray wiped his hands on a shop rag as he watched the driver's door open. A woman emerged, tall, silver-haired, wearing clothes that probably cost more than Ray's monthly mortgage payment. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge, but her eyes held something Ray recognized, the look of someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for too long. She approached the garage with measured steps, and Ray could see her taking in the details, the organized chaos of the workspace, the classic cars in various stages of restoration, the hand-painted sign that read Jensen's Classic Car Restoration in letters that Sarah had helped him design. "Mr. Jensen?" Her voice carried a slight tremor that suggested she was more nervous than her appearance indicated. "That's me. What can I do for you?" She paused, and Ray noticed her hands were shaking slightly. "I have a car that needs help. 1965 Mustang. It's not running." Ray glanced at Danny, who was watching the exchange with the frank curiosity of someone who'd never learned to hide his interest in people. "Well, you've come to the right place. Where's the car?" The woman, Ray realized he should ask her name, looked back toward the road. "It's about 2 miles down Highway 9. The engine just died. I managed to coast to the shoulder, but it won't start again. I can tow it in, take a look. Can't promise anything without seeing what we're dealing with, but Mustangs are my specialty." She nodded, relief flickering across her features. "Thank you. I'm Vivian Hale, by the way, Ray Jensen. This is my son, Danny." Danny stepped forward and extended his hand with the formal politeness Ray had taught him. "Nice to meet you, Miss Hale. Is it a coupe or convertible?" Vivian seemed surprised by the question, but she shook Danny's hand gently. "Convertible. Midnight blue with a white top." Danny's eyes lit up. "That's a beautiful combination. Original 289 V8? Yes, I think so. It was my father's car." Ray heard something in her voice when she mentioned her father, a note of loss that resonated with his own experience. "Well, let's go take a look. Danny, can you handle things here until Tom arrives?" "Of course, Dad. I'll organize the intake forms and get the Camaro ready for final inspection." Ray grabbed his keys and toolkit and followed Vivian to her sedan. As they drove toward the stranded Mustang, he found himself curious about this woman who'd appeared at his garage like a puzzle waiting to be solved. She was clearly wealthy, probably from the city, but there was something about her that suggested she was running from something or toward something she hadn't yet found. "How long have you had the car?" Ray asked as they drove. "My whole life. In a way, my father restored it when I was 16. I learned to drive in that car." She paused, staring out the window at the passing landscape. "I haven't driven it in years, but something made me want to take it out today." Ray nodded, understanding the pull of memory and the way certain cars could transport you back to moments that mattered. Classic cars have a way of calling to us when we need them most. They found the Mustang exactly where Vivien had described, pulled onto the shoulder of the two-lane highway, its hazard lights still blinking. Ray felt his breath catch as he saw the car. It was beautiful, even sitting disabled on the roadside. The midnight blue paint was immaculate, the chrome gleaming, the white convertible top perfectly maintained. "She's gorgeous," Ray said, running his hand along the front fender. "Your father did beautiful work. He was a perfectionist about that car. Spent every weekend for 2 years, getting every detail right." Ray popped the hood and immediately saw the problem. The engine was well maintained, but old, and the alternator had failed catastrophically. Oil and coolant had leaked onto other components, creating a mess that would require careful cleaning and assessment. "Good news and bad news," Ray said, straightening up. "The good news is it's fixable. The bad news is it's going to take some time. The alternator failed, but there's collateral damage. I'll need to clean everything, assess what else needs replacing, and track down the right parts." Vivien nodded, though Ray could see disappointment in her expression. "How long?" "Depends on the parts. Could be a week, could be 3. Some of these original components are getting hard to find." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the car as if it held answers to questions she hadn't yet asked. "I suppose I don't have much choice. There's a decent bed and breakfast in town. Mrs. Patterson runs it clean rooms, good breakfast. I can have the car towed to my shop this afternoon." "All right." Vivian's voice carried a note of resignation, but also something else maybe, relief at having a reason to stay put for a while. As they drove back to the garage, Ray found himself wondering what had brought Vivian Hale to his quiet corner of the world. She had the look of someone who was used to solving problems quickly, efficiently, with resources and connections most people couldn't imagine. But some problems couldn't be solved with money or influence. Some things required time, patience, and the willingness to trust someone else's expertise. Ray had a feeling that Vivian Hale's Mustang wasn't the only thing in need of repair. The boardroom at Hale Foundation headquarters had felt like a prison that morning, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that Vivien no longer found inspiring. 27 floors above the street, she'd sat at the head of a mahogany table worth more than most people's cars, listening to her board of directors debate the future of her life's work with the detached efficiency of accountants discussing quarterly projections. The Riverside Community Center project is hemorrhaging money, board member Harrison Webb had declared, his manicured fingers drumming against the polished wood. "We're 6 months behind schedule and $2 million over budget. That's because we're building something that will last," Vivien had replied, keeping her voice level despite the frustration building in her chest. "The families in that neighborhood deserve more than a quick fix. Sentiment doesn't balance budgets, Vivien." This from Margaret Ashford, whose family fortune came from oil drilling and strip mining. "We have fiduciary responsibilities." Vivien had stared around the table at faces she'd known for years, people she'd considered friends, all eyes in the mission of using wealth responsibly. But sitting there in their $1,000 suits, debating whether children deserved a safe place to play and learn, she'd felt the familiar weight of isolation that had been pressing down on her for months. "The community center stays funded," she'd said firmly. "We'll find the money elsewhere." "Where?" Harrison's voice had carried a note of challenge. "Your personal projects have already drained $30 million from the endowment this year. The African water wells, the scholarship program, the senior housing initiative, those aren't projects," Vivien had snapped, finally losing the composed facade she'd maintained for 2 hours. "They're human beings, real people with real needs." The silence that followed had been deafening. Margaret's expression had shifted to one of clinical concern, the look of someone evaluating a colleague's mental stability. "Perhaps you need some time to reconsider," Margaret had suggested. This level of emotional involvement isn't healthy for the foundation's long-term stability. That's when Vivian's cell phone had started ringing. Her assistant's apologetic face appeared on the screen, followed immediately by another call from her lawyer, then her accountant, then her brother calling from Switzerland, where he was supposed to be managing the foundation's European operations, but was probably skiing instead. "I need air," Vivian had announced, standing so abruptly that her chair rolled backward into the credenza. "The vote is scheduled for this afternoon," Harrison had called after her. "Postpone it. We can't keep delaying difficult decisions." Vivian had spun around, 30 years of frustration finally finding its voice. "These aren't difficult decisions for you because they don't matter to you. This foundation, these projects, the people we're supposed to be helping, none of it matters to you beyond the tax benefits and the social prestige." The words had hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. In the shocked silence that followed, Vivian's phone had buzzed again, then again, the sound echoing off the polished surfaces like accusations. Without another word, she'd pulled the phone from her purse and hurled it against the window. The device had shattered satisfyingly, plastic and glass fragments scattering across the Persian rug that cost more than some people's annual salaries. "Meeting adjourned," she'd said, and walked out. The elevator ride to the parking garage had felt eternal. Vivian's hands had been shaking from anger, from exhaustion, from the sudden clarity that her carefully constructed life had become a beautifully appointed cage. She'd built the foundation to honor her father's memory, to use the Hall fortune for something meaningful. Instead, she'd become a prisoner of other people's expectations and bureaucratic inertia. Her car, a sensible hybrid sedan chosen for its environmental impact rather than its soul, had sat in its reserved spot like a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Practical, efficient, joyless. At 60 years old, Vivian had realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd done something purely for the joy of it. That's when she'd remembered the Mustang, her father's 1965 convertible, had been sitting in climate-controlled storage for 3 years, ever since she'd moved to the city penthouse. James Hale had restored that car with his own hands, spending countless weekends in their suburban garage teaching his daughter about engines and craftsmanship and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful. "A car should make you feel alive," he used to say, watching her face light up as they worked together. "If it doesn't stir something in your soul, you're driving the wrong machine." The storage facility had been a 40-minute drive through traffic that seemed designed to test her patience. But when the attendant had rolled up the door and revealed the Mustang sitting beneath its protective cover, Vivian had felt something shift inside her chest. A midnight blue paint gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The white convertible top was pristine, and the chrome bumpers reflected her face back at her like mirrors. She'd signed the release papers with hands that were finally steady, tipped the attendant generously, and slid behind the wheel for the first time in years. The leather seats had welcomed her like an old friend's embrace, and when she'd turned the key, the 289 V8 had rumbled to life with a growl that seemed to emanate from some primal place in her chest. Driving out of the city had felt like braking, free from gravity. Each mile that passed had loosened another knot of tension in her shoulders. She'd put the top down once she cleared the suburban sprawl, letting the wind tear through her carefully styled hair and strip away the weight of obligation that had been suffocating her for months. She hadn't planned a destination. The goal was simply to drive until she found whatever it was she'd been missing. The highway had unwound before her like a promise, leading through small towns and farmland that reminded her of childhood trips with her father. He'd loved these back-road adventures, claiming they helped him think more clearly than any boardroom ever could. For the first time in months, Vivian had felt hopeful. The Mustang's engine had settled into a steady rhythm. The road had stretched endlessly ahead, and the future had seemed full of possibilities rather than obligations. Then the alternator had failed. The first sign of trouble had been subtle, a slight dimming of the dashboard lights, a barely perceptible change in the engine's note. Vivien had been too lost in the freedom of driving to notice immediately. By the time she'd realized something was wrong, steam had begun rising from under the hood, and the temperature gauge was climbing toward the red zone. She'd managed to coast to the shoulder of Highway 9, the engine dying just as she'd shifted into park. The sudden silence had been jarring after hours of mechanical symphony. Sitting there on the roadside, Vivien had felt the weight of her situation settle around her like a heavy blanket. No cell phone, no GPS, no idea where she was beyond, somewhere in farm country. The irony hadn't been lost on her. She'd run from the complications of her connected life only to find herself truly stranded for the first time in decades. A passing truck driver had stopped and offered to call for help. But when he'd asked what kind of assistance she needed, Vivien had realized she didn't know. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with a credit card and a phone call. A Mustang needed mechanical expertise, not just a tow to the nearest dealership. There's a classic car guy about 2 miles up the road, the trucker had suggested. Jensen's place. If anyone can fix an old Mustang, it's Ray. Standing now in Jensen's garage, watching this quiet man examine her father's car with gentle, knowing hands, Vivien felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The relief of trusting someone else's competence. Ray Jensen moved around the engine compartment with the confidence of someone who understood these machines intimately. His diagnosis had been swift and accurate, delivered without condescension or inflated estimates. 3 weeks, she repeated, testing the words. 3 weeks in a small town where nobody knew her name or her net worth. 3 weeks away from board meetings and conference calls, and the endless demands of people who wanted her money, but not her input. Maybe less if we get lucky with parts, Ray offered, misinterpreting her silence as disappointment. No, Vivien said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. 3 weeks sounds perfect. Ray's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't comment. She appreciated the absence of probing questions or assumptions about her circumstances. Danny emerged from the garage's office area, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of serious concentration. Miss Hale, I need to get some information for the work order. What's your phone number? Vivien almost laughed. I don't have one right now. It's broken. Oh. Danny considered this gravely. Well, we'll need an address where we can reach you. She's staying at Mrs. Patterson's bed and breakfast, Ray interjected. We can use that address for now. As Danny carefully wrote down the information, Vivien found herself studying the father and son dynamic. There was patience in Ray's voice when he spoke to Danny, but also respect the recognition that his son was a capable adult despite his differences. She'd seen too many families where disability was treated as something to be managed rather than accommodated. The Mustang has original date-coded parts, Danny announced, consulting his clipboard. That's going to make finding replacements more challenging, but also more authentic to the restoration. You know about date codes? Vivien asked. Danny nodded enthusiastically. Every part manufactured for classic cars has specific markings that tell you when and where it was made. Original parts are always preferable for maintaining authenticity, but they're harder to find and more expensive. Money isn't a concern, Vivien said automatically, then caught herself. In this context, that statement probably sounded presumptuous. Ray's expression didn't change. I'll find you the right parts at fair prices. That's how we do business here. Something in his tone-quiet dignity mixed with professional confidence made Vivien realized she'd entered a world where different rules applied. This wasn't about maximizing profit or leveraging advantage. This was about craftsmanship and integrity, values that seemed quaint in her boardroom but felt essential here. I'll call Tom Bradley about sourcing the alternator, Ray continued. He, Mrs. Patterson's bed and breakfast occupied a Victorian house on Maple Street that had been painted the color of butter and trimmed in sage green. Vivien stood on the wraparound porch with her single overnight bag, feeling overdressed in her business suit and wondering when she'd last stayed anywhere that required her to ring a doorbell instead of checking in at a marble-top reception desk. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 70, with silver hair pinned into a neat bun and eyes that seemed to take inventory of Vivien's appearance without judgment. "You must be the lady with the broken-down Mustang," Mrs. Patterson said, opening the door wider. Ray Jensen called ahead. "I'm Eleanor Patterson, but everyone calls me Ellie." "Vivian Hale. Thank you for accommodating me on such short notice." "Honey, in a town this size, short notice is the only kind we get. Come on in. I'll show you to the blue room. It's got the best view of the garden." The interior of the house was exactly what Vivien had expected. Floral wallpaper, antique furniture that had been lovingly maintained, and the faint scent of lemon polish mixed with something baking in the kitchen. It was the opposite of her sterile penthouse apartment, where every surface was chosen for its aesthetic impact rather than its comfort. The blue room was charming in its simplicity. A 4-poster bed with a handmade quilt, a writing desk positioned beneath a window overlooking a garden that would have made Sarah Jensen proud, and a bookshelf filled with well-worn paperbacks that suggested previous guests had found reasons to settle in for extended stays. "Breakfast is at 8, but I can be flexible if you're an early riser," Ellie said, setting fresh towels on the bed. "There's coffee available from 6 onward, and if you need anything else, just holler." After Ellie left, Vivien sat on the edge of the bed and surveyed her temporary accommodations. The room probably cost less per night than she typically spent on lunch, but it felt more welcoming than any 5-star hotel she'd ever stayed in. The quilt beneath her hands was soft with age and frequent washing, each patch telling a story. About fabric choices and careful stitching. Her first full day in town began with coffee on the front porch, watching the unhurried pace of small-town morning routines. People walked their dogs, retrieved newspapers from driveways, and called greetings to neighbors across picket fences. It was a world that operated according to rhythms she'd forgotten existed. After breakfast, homemade biscuits with honey that Ellie claimed came from her own beehives. Vivien walked the 6 blocks to Jensen's garage. The morning air carried the scent of honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass, and she found herself noticing details that would have been invisible from a car window. The way morning glory vines climbed every available fence post, the sound of screen doors slapping shut, the distant hum of lawn mowers beginning their daily symphony. Ray was already at work when she arrived, bent over the hood of the Camaro, with Danny beside him holding a flashlight. They moved together with the coordination of a team that had been working in tandem for years. Ray's hands adjusting something deep in the engine, while Danny anticipated which tool would be needed next. "Good morning," Vivien called from the doorway. Ray straightened, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Morning. How was your first night at Ellie's?" "Surprisingly comfortable. She made me feel very welcome. Ellie's good people. Been taking care of folks in this town for 30 years. Ray gestured toward the Mustang, which now occupied the bay nearest the office. "I've got your girl up on the lift. Want to see what we're dealing with?" Vivien followed him to where her father's car sat suspended above the garage floor, its undercarriage exposed like a patient on an operating table. Ray pointed out the various components that would need attention, not just the failed alternator, but belts and hoses that had deteriorated with age, gaskets that were beginning to leak, and a dozen other small issues that had been masked by the car's beautiful exterior. "It's like archaeology," Ray explained, his voice taking on the enthusiasm of someone discussing a favorite subject. "Your father did beautiful work, but some of these parts are 50 years old. Rubber deteriorates, metal corrodes, things that were perfectly fine when the car was stored start failing once you put them back into service." Danny appeared beside them, consulting his ever-present clipboard. I've researched the alternator specifications. We need a 38 AMP unit with a specific pulley configuration. Tom Bradley thinks he can locate one, but it might take a few days. What happens while we wait? Vivian asked. We work on everything else, Ray said. No point in installing a new alternator until we've addressed the underlying issues. Might as well do this right? Vivian found herself oddly relieved by this methodical approach. In her business world, delays were obstacles to be overcome with urgency and resources. Here, they seemed to be opportunities for thoroughness and quality. Is there anything I can do to help? The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise Ray. Help how? I don't know. Hold tools? Fetch things? I feel useless just standing around. Ray exchanged a glance with Danny, who shrugged with the pragmatism of someone accustomed to adapting routines. Well, Ray said slowly, I suppose you could start by learning what these tools are called. Hard to help if you don't know the difference between a socket wrench and a box-end wrench. For the next hour, Danny conducted an impromptu education session, introducing Vivian to the basic tools of automotive restoration. His teaching style was patient and precise, the same methodical approach he brought to organizing parts and maintaining inventory. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in sharing his knowledge, explaining not just what each tool is called, but why it was designed that way and when it would be most useful. This is a torque wrench, Danny said, holding up a device that looked more complicated than most of the tools Vivian had seen. It measures how tight you're making a bolt. Some things need to be exactly right, not too loose, not too tight. Dad says it's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, but for engines. Vivian smiled at the analogy, charmed by Danny's ability to make complex concepts accessible. And what happens if you get it wrong? Too loose and things fall apart. Too tight and things break. Getting it just right means everything works the way it's supposed to. Ray looked up from the engine compartment where he was removing the old alternator. Danny's got a gift for this work. Best parts organizer I've ever known, and I've been doing this for 20 years. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Vivian could see Danny straighten slightly at the praise. She thought about her own father, how he'd taken similar pride in teaching her about the Mustang's intricacies. There was something universal about this dynamic, the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, the satisfaction of sharing expertise with someone who appreciated it. Can you show me how to check the oil level? Vivian asked. Danny nodded enthusiastically, leading her to the Camaro. First, the engine needs to be warm, but not running. Then you pull out the dipstick. It's this long metal rod here, and clean it with a rag. Then you put it all the way back in. Wait a second, and pull it out again to read the oil level. Vivian followed his instructions, surprised by how satisfying it felt to perform this simple maintenance task. The oil level was perfect, and Danny beamed as if she'd accomplished something significant. Now you know how to check your own car's oil, he said. Dad says people should know basic maintenance, even if they don't do the work themselves. Your father's very wise. He's the smartest person I know about cars, and other things too. Ray emerged from under the Mustang's hood, his shirt damp with perspiration despite the morning cool. Alternator's out. Danny, can you add it to the parts list for Tom? As Danny hurried to update his meticulous records, Ray turned to Vivian. You don't have to entertain yourself here all day. There's probably more interesting things to see in town. Actually, I'm finding this quite fascinating. I haven't done anything with my hands in years, not real work anyway. It's refreshing. Ray studied her face as if trying to determine whether she was being polite or sincere. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. Well, if you're serious about learning, there's plenty to teach. But it's dirty work. And those clothes? He gestured at her business attire. Vivien looked down at her wool blazer and silk blouse, suddenly seeing them as costumes from a play she no longer wanted to perform in. I suppose I should invest in some work clothes. Miller's Hardware has basic coveralls. Nothing fancy, but they'll keep the grease off your good clothes. An hour later, Vivien returned to the garage wearing navy blue coveralls that were 3 sizes too large and work boots that squeaked with every step. She felt ridiculous and oddly liberated at the same time. Danny clapped his hands together when he saw her. Now you look like a real mechanic. Well, except for your hair. Vivien touched her carefully styled silver hair, suddenly conscious of how impractical it was for manual labor. I suppose I'll need to figure something out. Mom used to wear bandanas, Danny said, then stopped abruptly, his expression shifting. I mean, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. It's okay, Danny, Ray said gently. You can talk about Mom. Miss Hale won't mind. Vivien felt the weight of grief that hung between father and son, the careful way they navigated around the absence that shaped their daily lives. I'd love to hear about your mother, she said. She sounds like she was a wonderful woman. Danny's face brightened again. She was. She knew almost as much about cars as Dad, and she made the best chocolate chip cookies. She said knowing how to fix things was important for everyone, not just men. She was ahead of her time, Ray added. Sarah could rebuild a carburetor and bake a perfect pie on the same day. Made the rest of us look inadequate. There was love in his voice when he spoke about his wife, but also a deep sadness that Vivien recognized. She'd seen the same expression on her own face in mirrors after her father's death, the look of someone still negotiating the boundary between memory and loss. The rest of the morning passed in comfortable collaboration. Vivien proved surprisingly adept at organizing small parts and keeping track of the sequence in which components were removed. Her business background, it turned out, translated well to the methodical nature of automotive restoration. You're a natural at this, Ray said as they broke for lunch. Most people get frustrated with how slow it goes, but you seem to understand that good work takes time. I spent my career rushing through things, Vivien admitted. It's nice, too. Work on something where quality matters more than speed. They ate sandwiches from the deli across the street, sitting on upturned milk crates in the garage, while Danny read them specifications from his ever-present reference materials. The food was simple but satisfying, and Vivien found herself genuinely enjoying the company in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Her phone might be broken, her schedule completely disrupted, and her board of directors probably plotting her removal, but sitting in this modest garage with these 2 generous men, Vivien felt something she'd almost forgotten: contentment. By the end of her first week in town, Vivien had developed calluses on her palms and grease stains under her fingernails that no amount of scrubbing seemed capable of removing completely. She'd also discovered muscles in her back and shoulders that had apparently been dormant for decades, protesting their sudden reactivation with a persistent ache that she found oddly satisfying. Ray's initial skepticism about her commitment to learning had given way to grudging respect as she proved capable of following complex instructions and remembering details from previous days' work. Her business background, it turned out, was excellent preparation for the systematic nature of automotive restoration. Every component had to be cataloged, every step documented, every decision justified by measurable results. Hand me the 3/8 socket, Ray called from beneath the Mustang's hood, where he was working to remove the old water pump. Vivien consulted the shadow board where Danny had organized all the tools, found the correct socket, and passed it to Ray without hesitation. 2 weeks ago, she wouldn't have known a socket from a screwdriver. Now she could identify most of the garage's basic tools and had even learned to operate the hydraulic lift under careful supervision. You're getting good at this, Danny observed, updating his restoration log with the afternoon's progress. Most people can't remember which socket is which. I have a good teacher, Vivien replied, and meant it. Danny's patience was extraordinary, his explanations clear and detailed without being condescending. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in sharing his knowledge, and Vivien had begun to suspect that his teaching ability was being underutilized. The morning routine had evolved into something she looked forward to: coffee with Ellie on the bed, and breakfast's front porch, a walk through town that had become familiar and comforting, and arrival at the garage just as Ray and Danny were getting started for the day. She'd begun bringing better coffee, a small contribution that Ray had accepted with the same quiet grace he brought to everything else. "Tom Bradley's coming by this afternoon," Ray announced, emerging from under the hood with the old water pump in his hands. "Says he might have found our alternator." Tom turned out to be a man in his 60s, with grease-stained coveralls and a pickup truck that looked like it had been assembled from parts of several different vehicles. His arrival was accompanied by the sound of rattling metal and the diesel engine that probably violated several emission standards, but ran with the reliability of a machine that had been properly maintained for decades. "Ray Jensen, you old dog," Tom called out, climbing down from the cab with the careful movements of someone whose joints had logged too many miles. "Heard you got yourself a helper. Tom Bradley, meet Vivian Hale. She's learning the trade while we fix her father's Mustang." Tom's handshake was firm and brief, his eyes taking in Vivian's coveralls and work boots with the assessment of someone who could recognize pretense from 50 yards. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. "Well, let's see what we're working with," he said, approaching the Mustang with the reverence of someone who appreciated fine machinery. "65 convertible, 289 V8. Your daddy had good taste." Tom's truck contained an automotive treasure trove that seemed to defy organizational logic. Parts bins were stacked 3 deep, cardboard boxes overflowed with components that might fit anything from a Model T to a modern muscle car, and somehow Tom knew exactly where everything was located. "Found your alternator in Topeka," he announced, producing a rebuilt unit that looked factory fresh. 65 Mustang, 38 AMP, correct pulley configuration. Even found the original mounting brackets. Ray examined the part with the careful attention of someone who understood that small details could make the difference between authenticity and approximation. "This is perfect, Tom. What do I owe you?" The negotiation that followed was conducted in the abbreviated language of men who'd been doing business together for years. Numbers were mentioned, counteroffers suggested, and a final price agreed upon with handshakes rather than paperwork. Vivien found herself charmed by the simplicity of it all, business conducted on trust and mutual respect rather than contracts. And legal protections. "You know, Ray," Tom said as they completed the transaction, "you ought to think about teaching this stuff formally. There's kids coming out of high school who don't know a carburetor from a transmission, but they're interested in learning." "I've got my hands full with the business and Danny," Ray replied. But Vivien caught something in his voice, not dismissal, but the careful consideration of someone who'd thought about the idea before Dot. After Tom left, they spent the afternoon installing the new alternator and related components. Ray worked with the methodical precision Vivien had come to admire, checking and double-checking every connection before moving to the next step. Danny documented everything in his detailed logs, creating a record that would be invaluable if future maintenance was needed. "Why don't you teach?" Vivien asked during a break, remembering Tom's suggestion. "You're both natural teachers." Ray shrugged, deflecting the compliment. "Teaching's a full-time job. I've got customers depending on me, and Danny needs his routines. But you could reach so many people. Think about all the young adults who might benefit from learning a useful trade, especially if they have different learning styles like Danny." She saw something flicker in Ray's expression: interest, maybe, or recognition of a possibility he'd been afraid to consider. "Mom always said Dad should teach," Danny added unexpectedly. She said he was too good at explaining things to keep it all to himself. The mention of Sarah created one of those moments of silence that seemed to honor her memory, while acknowledging her continued influence on their decisions. Vivien had learned to recognize these pauses, to let them exist without feeling compelled, to fill them with words. "What did your mother do?" Vivien asked gently. "She was a nurse," Ray said. "Pediatric ICU at the regional hospital. 30 years of taking care of kids who needed someone to believe in them. She helped families when their children were sick," Danny explained. "She said everyone deserves to have someone in their corner, especially when things get scary." Vivien felt a pang of recognition. Sarah Jensen sounded like someone who'd understood the responsibility that came with having resources and skills that could help others. The parallel to her own foundation work was obvious, but somehow Sarah had managed to make a direct impact on individual lives rather than getting lost in bureaucratic structures. She sounds like an extraordinary woman. She was. Ray's voice carried that familiar note of love mixed with loss. Always saw potential in people that others missed. Sighed Danny was going to surprise everyone someday with what he could accomplish. She was right, Vivien said, watching Danny carefully organize the tools they'd used that afternoon. He's already surprising people? The afternoon stretched into evening as they finished the alternator installation and tested the electrical system. Everything functioned perfectly, lights bright, gauges responsive, the engine turning over with the healthy sound of a machine returning to proper working order. "She's almost ready for a test drive," Ray announced, wiping his hands on the shop rag he kept tucked into his belt. "Few more days to finish the belt replacement and check the cooling system, then we'll see how she runs." "I'm not sure I remember how to drive a manual transmission," Vivien admitted. "It's been years since I've operated a clutch." "Like riding a bicycle," Ray assured her. "Muscle memory comes back fast. Maybe you could give me a refresher lesson?" The request surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise Ray. She'd intended to take possession of the car and drive away, returning to her complicated life in the city. But somewhere over the past week, her plans had become less urgent, her timeline more flexible. "I suppose we could arrange that," Ray said carefully. "Wouldn't want you stalling out at the first traffic light." As they cleaned up for the day, Vivien found herself studying the garage with new appreciation. What had initially seemed like controlled chaos now revealed itself as a carefully orchestrated workspace, where every tool had its place and every project followed logical progression from problem to solution. It was a small business built on expertise and integrity values that seemed increasingly rare in her own professional world. "Ray, can I ask you something?" Vivien said as they prepared to lock up. "Sure. Are you happy? I mean, is this enough? For you, the garage, the town, the life you've built here?" Ray was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm content," he said finally. "That's not the same thing as happy, but it's not nothing either. Danny's safe and thriving. The business pays the bills. We're part of a community that looks out for each other. After what we've been through, content feels like enough." Vivien nodded, understanding the distinction he was making. Contentment was what she'd been missing in her own life. The sense that what she was doing mattered, that her daily efforts contributed to something larger than herself. Walking back to the bed and breakfast. As the sun set behind the trees lining Maple Street, Vivien realized she'd stopped thinking about her broken phone or the board meeting she was missing, or the crises that were probably accumulating in her absence. For the first time in years, she was fully present in her own life, engaged with work that produced tangible results in relationships that felt genuine rather than strategic. The Mustang would be ready soon, and she'd have to make a decision about what came next. But tonight, sitting on Ellie's front porch with a cup of tea and the sound of crickets beginning their evening concert, Vivien found herself hoping that soon was still several days away. 2 weeks into her stay, Vivian discovered Sarah Jensen's garden journal, tucked between repair manuals in the garage office. Its leather cover worn soft with handling, and its pages filled with pressed flowers and careful notations about soil, conditions, planting schedules, and the personalities of various flowering plants. May 15th. The climbing roses need more support. One entry read in Sarah's careful handwriting. Like people, they grow better when they have something strong to lean on. Our installed new trellis today, said the roses reminded him of me. Always reaching for something higher. Vivian had found the journal while searching for a parts catalog Ray had mentioned, but once she'd opened it, she'd been unable to put it down. Each page revealed another layer of the woman who'd shared this life with Ray and Danny, someone who'd found poetry in practical things and wisdom in the patience required to nurture growing things. June 3rd. Danny helped me plant the marigolds today. His spacing is more precise than mine perfectly measured distances, all in neat rows. He said the flowers need their own space to grow properly, just like people. Sometimes I think he understands the world better than the rest of us. You found Mom's journal, Danny said, peering in the office doorway with his clipboard and the slightly uncertain expression he wore when emotional topics arose unexpectedly. I'm sorry, Vivian said, closing the book immediately. I was looking for the parts catalog and saw this. I shouldn't have. It's okay, Danny interrupted, settling into the chair beside her desk. Mom wrote it for people to read. She said gardens are meant to be shared, and so are the stories about them. Vivian reopened the journal, turning to a page where a pressed violet had been carefully mounted next to detailed notes about soil pH and companion planting. She was very observant. She noticed everything. Dad says I get my attention to detail from her. Danny paused, organizing his thoughts with the care he brought to everything else. Would you like to see her garden? Dad still takes care of it, but he doesn't talk about it much. The garden behind the Jensen house was larger than Vivian had expected, laid out in sections that revealed Sarah's systematic approach to cultivation. Vegetables occupied raised beds near the kitchen door. Herbs spiraled outward from a central sundial, and flowering plants had been arranged to provide color from early spring through late fall. Ray was kneeling among the tomato plants when they found him, his hands gentle as he tied new growth to wooden stakes. He looked up at their approach, and Vivian saw something in his expression, not embarrassment. Exactly, but the vulnerability of someone caught tending something precious. Danny's giving you the tour? Ray asked, wiping soil from his hands. The journal led to questions, Vivian said simply. This is beautiful, Ray. Sarah designed all of this? Most of it. I just tried to keep it going the way she would have wanted. He gestured toward a section where roses climbed a wooden trellis, their blooms heavy with the morning's dew. Those are her pride and joy. Eden roses, she called them. Said they reminded her that beautiful things are worth the effort they require. Vivian walked among the carefully tended beds, noting the way different plants had been paired to complement each other's growth patterns and nutritional needs. It was gardening as engineering, but with an artist's eye for color and texture. She must have spent hours out here, every morning before work, every evening when she got home. Side it kept her grounded, reminded her that growth takes time and patience. Ray's voice carried the weight of someone who'd had these conversations with himself many times. I'm not as good at it as she was, but I couldn't bear to let it die. You're doing beautifully, Vivian said, and meant it. The garden showed signs of loving care weeds kept at bay, plants properly watered, the kind of consistent attention that could only come from genuine commitment. Danny had wandered toward the herb section, where he was examining the basil plants with scientific precision. Ms. Hale, did you know that basil grows better when you harvest it regularly? Mom taught me that cutting the stems actually makes the plant stronger. I didn't know that. What else did she teach you about gardening? For the next hour, Danny shared his mother's gardening wisdom with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found an appreciative audience. He showed Vivien the companion planting arrangements, explained the rotation schedule that kept the soil healthy, and described the careful balance of sun and shade that Sarah had achieved through strategic tree placement. Mom said gardens teach you about life, Danny concluded, stroking the leaves of a particularly robust pepper plant. Sometimes you have to cut things back so they can grow stronger. Sometimes you have to wait longer than you want for something good to happen. And sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most ordinary seeds. Ray had been listening quietly, and Vivien saw something shift in his expression as his son spoke pride. Certainly, but also a kind of wonder at hearing Sarah's philosophy articulated so clearly. Your mother was a wise woman, Vivien said. She was. And she always said that wisdom doesn't count for much unless you share it with people who can use it. Back at the garage that afternoon, they returned to the methodical work of restoration. The Mustang's engine bay was cleaner than it had probably been since 1965. Each component either rebuilt or replaced with period-correct parts that Tom Bradley had sourced from his mysterious network of suppliers. We should talk about the test drive, Ray said as they installed new belts and checked fluid levels. Weather's supposed to be good tomorrow, and she's mechanically sound. Vivien felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness. For weeks, the test drive had been an abstract goal, something that would happen eventually. Now that it was imminent, she realized she'd been avoiding thinking about what it would mean, not just driving the car, but having it ready to take her wherever she decided to go. Are you nervous? Danny asked, displaying his uncanny ability to read emotional undercurrents. A little, Vivien admitted. It's been a long time since I've driven anything like this. Dad's a good teacher. He taught me to drive in the Camaro when I turned 18. Mom was worried about me learning on a car with that much power. But Dad said understanding the machine makes you a better driver. Is that true? Vivien asked Ray. Partly. But mostly I think Sarah was worried I'd turn our son into a speed demon. Ray's smile carried affection for both his wife's concerns and his son's careful approach to everything. Danny's the most cautious driver I know. Follows every rule, checks his mirrors constantly, never exceeds the speed limit. Safe driving is important, Danny said seriously. Mom always said cars are powerful tools that deserve respect. As they worked, Vivien found herself studying the dynamic between father and son with new appreciation. Ray's protectiveness was obvious, but so was his respect for Danny's capabilities. He created opportunities for his son to contribute meaningfully while ensuring that challenges remained manageable. It was parenting as partnership, and Vivien suspected Sarah's influence was evident in every interaction. Can I ask you something personal? Vivien said during their afternoon break. Ray nodded, settling onto one of the milk crates they used as impromptu seating. Do you ever think about the future? I mean, long-term plans beyond just keeping the business running? Ray was quiet for a moment, considering the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. I try not to plan too far ahead. After Sarah died, I learned that life can change completely in ways you never see coming. Now I focus on making sure Danny's secure and happy, keeping the business stable, being a good neighbor. That feels like enough responsibility for one person. But what about your own dreams? The things you wanted to do before life got complicated? Most of my dreams were tied up with Sarah and raising Danny. We talked about traveling when he got older, maybe expanding the business, teaching restoration classes at the community college. Ray's voice carried a note of wistfulness. But dreams adapt to circumstances. I'm not unhappy with how things turned out. Vivien heard echoes of her own compromises in his words, the way life gradually narrowed your options until you convinced yourself that adaptation was the same thing as fulfillment. What about you? Ray asked. What dreams are you avoiding by staying here and playing mechanic? The question caught her off guard with its directness. I'm not avoiding them. I'm trying to figure out what they are, and I used to think I wanted to change the world, use my resources to make a meaningful difference. But somewhere along the way, making a difference became managing other people's ideas about how to make a difference. I lost track of what I actually cared about. Ray nodded as if this made perfect sense. Sarah used to say that sometimes you have to stop moving before you can figure out which direction you actually want to go. Is that what I'm doing here? Stopping? Maybe. Or maybe you're learning something new about yourself. Ray stood and stretched, his joints protesting the afternoon's work. Either way, the Mustang will be ready when you are. That evening, Vivien sat in the garden behind Ellie's bed and breakfast, reading more of Sarah's journal by the light of the porch lamp. The entries chronicled not just the seasons of growth and dormancy, but the deeper rhythms of a life lived with attention and intention. September 12th. The morning glories are reaching the top of their trellis. R wants to cut them back. Says they're getting too aggressive for the space. But I think they're just doing what morning glories do, reaching toward the light, growing, as much as their environment allows. Sometimes the most beautiful things happen when we stop trying to control growth and simply provide good conditions for it. Vivien closed the journal and looked up at the stars, visible here in ways they never were in the city. Tomorrow she would drive her father's car for the first time in years, and after that she would have to decide what came next. But tonight, sitting in this quiet garden with Sarah's wisdom echoing in her thoughts, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the patience to let the answer reveal itself in its own time. The test drive was scheduled for Thursday morning, but Wednesday evening found Ray in his workshop behind the garage, bent over a partially completed project that he abandoned months earlier. The rocking chair sat on his workbench like an accusation smooth. Oak curves that had been carefully shaped and sanded, joints fitted with the precision of someone who understood that furniture, like relationships, required patience and attention to detail. He'd started the chair during Sarah's final remission, when hope had briefly made long-term projects seem possible again. The plan had been to finish it in time for the grandchildren they talked about having someday. Danny might not father children himself, but Sarah had been convinced that love had many ways of expanding families. The cancer's return had stopped the project mid-construction, and Ray had covered the unfinished chair with a tarp rather than throwing it away. Some abandonment felt too final, too much like giving up on possibilities that might still matter someday. Now, with calloused hands that smelled faintly of motor oil, Ray picked up his sandpaper and resumed the work of smoothing the chair's armrests. The rhythmic motion was meditative, requiring just enough attention to quiet the restless thoughts that had been plaguing him since Vivian's arrival had disrupted the careful equilibrium of his life. "Dad?" Danny's voice came from the workshop doorway, carrying the slight uncertainty that meant he was navigating emotional territory. "In here, buddy." Danny approached the workbench with his characteristic careful steps, taking in the uncovered rocking chair with an expression that cycled through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been sadness. "You're working on Mom's chair." "Your mom's chair," Ray corrected gently. She picked out the design, chose the wood, even helped with some of the detail work before she got too tired. Danny nodded, running his fingers along the chair's smooth curves with the same appreciation for craftsmanship that he brought to automotive restoration. She said it would be perfect for reading bedtime stories. She had very specific ideas about what grandchildren would need. Ray set down his sandpaper and looked at his son. "What do you think about Miss Hale?" The question seemed to catch Danny off guard, though he considered it with his usual seriousness. "I like her. She listens when I explain things, and she's not impatient when I need to do things my way. Also, she makes you smile more. I smile plenty. Not the same kind of smiles. These are the kind you used to have when Mom was here, the ones that reach your eyes." Ray felt something tighten in his chest at his son's observation. Danny's emotional intelligence often surprised people who mistook his careful processing for lack of awareness. But Ray knew better. His son saw everything, understood more than he usually let on. "She's going to leave soon," Ray said carefully. "Once the car's fixed, she'll go back to her life in the city. Maybe. Or maybe she'll decide she likes it here. Her life is complicated, Danny. She has responsibilities, obligations that we can't really understand." Danny was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts with characteristic precision. Mom always said that people make time for things that matter to them. If Miss Hale wanted to stay, wouldn't she find a way? The simplicity of the observation hit Ray like a gentle blow. In his son's worldview, desire and action were more closely connected than they seemed to be in most adults' lives. If you wanted something, you figured out how to get it. If you cared about someone, you found ways to be near them. "What if she doesn't want to stay?" Ray asked. "Then you'll miss her, but you'll be okay. You were okay before she came, and you'll be okay after she leaves. But maybe you could ask her what she wants instead of deciding for her." Ray stared at his son, struck once again by the wisdom that emerged from Danny's unfiltered perspective on human behavior. When had his 28-year-old son become the relationship expert in their family? "When did you get so smart about people?" "Mom taught me. She said the most important thing about caring for someone is paying attention to what they actually need, not what you think they need." That night, Ray lay awake thinking about needs his own, Danny's, and the carefully controlled desires he'd been trying not to acknowledge since Vivien had arrived in their quiet world. For 3 years, he'd built a life around predictability and emotional safety. Danny's routines, the garage's steady rhythm, the comfortable distance of community relationships that required nothing more complicated than mutual respect. Vivian's presence had revealed the limitations of that carefully constructed existence. Her curiosity about everything from torque specifications to local history had reminded him of conversations he'd missed having. Her willingness to learn had awakened his dormant teaching instincts. Her obvious intelligence and subtle humor had made him remember what it felt like to enjoy someone's company without agenda or obligation. But more than that, she'd made him remember what it felt like to want something beyond mere maintenance of the status quo. Thursday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that made everything seem possible. Ray arrived at the garage early, wanting to give the Mustang one final inspection before its first real test in years. The car sat in, the bay like a sleeping thoroughbred, all that power and beauty waiting to be awakened. Ray had restored dozens of classic cars, but this one felt different. Every component had been selected and installed with extra care, every detail attended to with the kind of perfectionism usually reserved for show cars rather than daily drivers. "Looks good," Vivien said from behind him. Ray turned to find her dressed in the work clothes that had become her uniform over the past weeks. But today she'd added a colorful scarf that brightened her appearance and suggested someone preparing for a celebration. "Ready for this?" Ray asked. "As ready as I'll ever be. Though I have to admit, I'm nervous about embarrassing myself." "Driving's like dancing," Danny announced, appearing with his clipboard and camera. "Mom always said that. Once you learn the steps, your body remembers even when your mind gets confused." "When did your mother learn to dance?" Vivien asked. "High school. Dad took her to prom, and she was worried about looking foolish. But she said once the music started, everything felt natural." Ray felt heat rise in his cheeks at the unexpected memory. He'd forgotten about that conversation, the way Sarah had worried about her dancing ability right up until the moment they stepped onto the gym floor and discovered they moved well together. "Your mother was a natural at most things," Ray said. "I suspect you will be, too." They spent an hour going over the car's controls and quirks. Vivien reacquainted herself with the clutch pedal, practiced finding the gear positions, and listened carefully as Ray explained the differences between her father's car and the modern vehicles she was accustomed to driving. No power steering, so you'll need to muscle it through tight turns. No power brakes either, so you'll need more pressure and distance to stop. And the clutch has a narrow engagement zone. It's either in or out, not much middle ground. Sounds intimidating, just different. Your father would have made sure everything was adjusted properly for smooth operation. The moment of truth arrived with surprising suddenness. 1 minute they were discussing theoretical driving techniques, and the next Vivien was sliding behind the wheel with Ray in the passenger seat and Danny positioned safely outside the garage, with his camera ready to document the occasion. The engine turned over immediately, settling into the distinctive rumble that marked a properly tuned V8. Vivian's hands found the steering wheel with the muscle memory Ray had predicted, and her left foot automatically sought the clutch pedal. "Take your time," Ray said. "No hurry, no pressure." Vivien nodded, her concentration evident in the careful way she tested the clutch engagement point and shifted into first gear. The car lurched slightly as she found the balance between clutch and accelerator, then smoothed out as they rolled slowly toward the garage's open bay door. "I remember this feeling," she said, a smile spreading across her face as they emerged into the morning sunlight. "Like having a conversation with the machine." "That's exactly right. Good drivers listen to what the car is telling them." They spent the next hour driving the quiet roads around town, Ray offering gentle guidance as Vivien rediscovered the rhythms of manual transmission driving. Her confidence grew with each successful shift, each smooth turn, each hill climb that demonstrated the engine's restored power. "She runs beautifully," Vivien said as they pulled back into the garage. "Your work is flawless, Ray." "Our work," Ray corrected. "You contributed more than you probably realize." Danny was waiting with his camera and clipboard, beaming with the satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed a successful completion. "How did it feel?" "Like coming home," Vivien said, then paused as if surprised by her own words. "I mean, like reconnecting with something important that I'd lost track of." They spent the rest of the morning completing final details, checking fluid levels, testing all the electrical systems one more time, ensuring that every component was functioning within specifications. It was busy work, mostly, but Ray found himself grateful for tasks that postponed the moment when the restoration would be officially complete. "I suppose that's it," Vivien said as they finished the final inspection. "She's ready to go home." "Where's home?" Danny asked with his characteristic directness. Vivien was quiet for a long moment, and Ray saw something uncertain in her expression. Not confusion, exactly, but the look of someone who'd realized that the question was more complicated than it appeared. "I'm not sure anymore," she said finally. "I have an apartment in the city, but I'm not sure it feels like home. I have a foundation office where I spend most of my time, but that's work, not home. I suppose I'll figure it out." "Maybe home isn't a place," Danny suggested. "Maybe it's the people you want to be around and the work that makes you happy." Ray watched Vivian's face as she considered this definition, saw something shift in her expression that suggested Danny's observation had hit closer to truth than either of them had expected. "In that case," she said slowly, "I might need to reconsider my travel plans." The private investigator's report fell from Vivian's purse like a confession, its manila folder splaying open across the garage floor to reveal photographs and documents that Ray recognized with the sick certainty of someone seeing as private. Life laid bare by a stranger's camera. Danny had been helping Vivien organize tools when her bag tumbled from the workbench, spilling its contents across the oil-stained concrete. The folder had been hidden beneath makeup compacts and business cards, but now its contents were scattered like evidence at a crime scene. Photographs of Ray working in the garden, financial records detailing his outstanding medical bills, copies of Danny's disability assessments, and a comprehensive background report that reduced their family's tragedy to bullet points and dollar amounts. "What is this?" Ray asked, his voice carefully controlled as he knelt to examine a photograph that showed him and Danny walking to the garage. Picture that could only have been taken from the road with a telephoto lens. Vivian's face had gone pale, her hands trembling as she reached for the scattered papers. Ray, I can explain. Explain what? That you hired someone to spy on us? He held up another photograph, this one showing Danny organizing parts in the garage. That you researched us like we were potential investments? It's not what it looks like. It looks like you knew exactly who we were before your car broke down. Ray's voice was rising despite his efforts to stay calm. It looks like none of this was an accident. Danny had frozen beside the workbench, his clipboard clutched against his chest, and his eyes wide with the confusion of someone trying to process an emotional situation that defied his careful understanding of how people were supposed to behave. The car trouble was real, Vivian said desperately. I didn't plan for the alternator to fail. But you planned to come here? You planned to find us. Ray's hands shook as he flipped through the investigator's report, seeing his family's private struggles cataloged with bureaucratic precision. Sarah's medical expenses, Danny's care costs, our income, our debts, our... God, what were we to you? Some kind of charity project? Please, just let me explain. Explain what? That you felt sorry for the poor widower and his disabled son? That you thought we needed saving by someone with enough money to hire private investigators? Vivian's composure cracked, tears beginning to stream down her face. It wasn't like that. I wasn't trying to manipulate you. Then what were you trying to do? Ray demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you turned our grief into your entertainment. I was lonely. The words burst from Vivian with such force that both Ray and Danny stepped back in surprise. I was lonely and exhausted, and I'd lost track of what actually mattered. And I read about your family in a local newspaper article about Sarah's memorial garden, and I thought maybe I could help somehow. Ray stared at her, processing this admission. You read about us in the newspaper? The article about the community garden Sarah started at the hospital. About how she'd wanted to create a place where families could find peace during difficult times. About how you and Danny were continuing her work even after she died. Vivian wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of mascara across her cheek. It was the most beautiful thing I'd read in months. Real people doing real good in the world, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Danny had been listening with the intense concentration he brought to processing complex information. You wanted to help with Mom's garden? I wanted to understand how you did it. How you found meaning in loss. How you kept caring for other people when you were hurting yourselves. Vivian's voice was barely above a whisper. My foundation gives away millions of dollars every year, but I couldn't tell you the name of a single person we've actually helped. You were helping people individually, personally, and I thought maybe if I understood how you did that ... So you hired an investigator to research us like lab rats, Ray said, but some of the anger had drained from his voice. I hired someone to learn about the garden project. The rest of the information came because I asked for a comprehensive report. Vivian's shoulders sagged with the weight of admission. I wanted to know if you were genuine, if the article was accurate or just good publicity. And I discovered that you were dealing with enormous medical debt from Sarah's treatment, that Danny's care costs were straining your budget, that you were choosing between keeping the business afloat and maintaining the quality of life Sarah would have wanted for your son. Ray felt something cold settle in his stomach. So you decided to help the poor, struggling family. I decided to try to meet you, to see if there was a way to contribute to Sarah's garden project that wouldn't insult your independence or compromise your dignity. Vivian's voice gained strength as she found her footing in the explanation. The broken alternator was real, Ray. I'd been driving for hours, trying to figure out how to approach you when the car actually broke down. Convenient timing. Terrible timing. I'd been planning to meet you properly, to introduce myself, and explain about the Foundation's interest in community gardens. Instead, I showed up as a stranded motorist, and you were so kind, so generous, with your time and expertise, that I couldn't figure out how to tell you the truth without it sounding like manipulation. Danny had been following the conversation with visible effort, his face cycling through confusion, hurt, and something that might have been understanding. Ms. Hale, did you pay some of Dad's bills? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Vivian's silence was answer enough. Which ones? Ray asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The largest of the outstanding medical bills, the ones that were affecting your credit and threatening the business loan. How much? It doesn't matter. How much, Vivian? $47,000. Ray sank onto one of the milk crates they used for seating, the number hitting him like a physical blow. That was more money than his business made in a good year, more than he could have paid off in a decade, even with aggressive payment plans. You paid $47,000 to help people you'd never met? I paid $47,000 because Sarah's garden project was exactly the kind of direct, personal philanthropy my foundation should be supporting, and because your family deserved to grieve without the additional stress of financial ruin. But you never told us. How could I? By the time I realized I cared about you as people rather than a project, it was too late to explain without it seeming like I'd been dishonest from the beginning. Danny had been listening with the focused attention he brought to solving complex problems. Were you being dishonest? The simple directness of the question seemed to catch Vivian off guard. Yes. Not intentionally, but yes. I let you believe I was just a stranded motorist when I was actually someone who'd been researching your family. I let a connection develop under false pretenses. But did you mean it? Danny persisted. When you said you enjoyed learning about cars and spending time with us, did you mean that? Or were you pretending? I meant every word. That's what makes this so complicated, Danny. I came here with one intention, but what happened between us was completely genuine. Ray looked up at Vivian, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. She looked nothing like the composed woman who'd arrived 3 weeks ago. Her hair was coming loose from its ponytail. Her work clothes were stained with motor oil, and her face showed the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying a heavy secret. You could have told me, he said quietly. After the first week, after we'd gotten to know each other, you could have explained. I tried a dozen times. But every time I started to bring it up, I realized how it would sound. By the way, I've been paying your bills and researching your family, but I really do enjoy your company. How does that not sound like manipulation? It sounds like honesty. Complicated honesty, but honesty. Vivian was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of lost opportunities and poor timing. I was afraid you'd ask me to leave. I am asking you to leave. The words hung in the air, between them like a sentence. Danny made a small sound of protest, but Ray continued with the careful control of someone who'd made a difficult decision. Not because I don't understand why you did it, and not because I don't appreciate the help with the bills, but because I can't tell what's real anymore. Was any of this genuine, or was I just an interesting diversion for someone who is bored with her real life? It was genuine, Vivian said, her voice breaking. Every conversation, every shared meal, every moment in the garden, all of it was real. Maybe, but I'll never know for sure, will I? There will always be the question of whether you stayed because you cared or because you felt guilty about the deception. Ray stood and walked to where the Mustang sat in the bay, its restoration complete and its engine ready to carry Vivian back to whatever life she chose to build. He ran his hand along the fender one last time, appreciating the smoothness of the paint and the precision of the bodywork. She's ready, he said, without turning around. Everything's been tested, all the paperwork is complete. You're free to go whenever you want. Ray, please, the bill is on the desk in the office. I've itemized everything: parts, labor, and shop fees. I think you'll find it fair." He heard Vivien gathering the scattered papers, stuffing them back into the folder with movements that sounded hurried and desperate. When he finally turned around, she was standing beside the Mustang, with her purse clutched against her chest and tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry that I handled this badly. You and Danny are the best people I've met in years, and I ruined it by being too proud and too scared to tell you the truth from the beginning." "I know," Ray said quietly. "I'm sorry too." Danny had been watching this exchange with visible distress, his usual calm disrupted by the emotional chaos swirling around him. "Are you really leaving, Miss Hale?" "I think that would be best for everyone. But what about the garden project? What about learning to drive manual transmission? What about the rocking chair Dad's been working on?" Ray felt his son's questions like physical blows, each one highlighting connections that would be severed, possibilities that would remain unfulfilled. "Danny, sometimes people have to make difficult choices, even when they don't want to. But this seems like a wrong choice. Miss Hale made a mistake, but she was trying to help, and she made you happy. And she learned to use tools, and she cared about Mom's garden, and she brought good coffee." Danny's voice rose with the agitation of someone who couldn't understand why adults made life more complicated than it needed to be. "Sometimes caring about someone means letting them go," Ray said. Though the words felt like glass in his throat, Vivien had been listening to this exchange with her own expression of grief and loss. "Danny's right that I made you happy," she said quietly. "But he's also right that I made a mistake. A big one. And sometimes mistakes have consequences, even when everyone involved wishes they didn't." She approached Danny and took his hands gently. "Thank you for teaching me so much, and for being patient with all my questions. You're going to do amazing things with your life, and your father is lucky to have you." Danny's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want you to go. I don't want to go either. But sometimes what we want isn't what's best." Vivien released Danny's hands and turned to face Ray one last time. "Thank you for everything. For fixing the car, for teaching me about restoration, for letting me be part of your world for a while. I'll never forget any of it." Ray wanted to say something to find words that would bridge the gap between understanding and forgiveness, but his throat felt closed with emotions he couldn't untangle. Vivien climbed into the Mustang and started the engine, its rumble filling the garage. With the sound of departure, she backed carefully out of the bay, turned toward the road, and drove away without looking back. Ray and Danny stood in the sudden silence, watching the empty space where the car had been and listening to the engine's note fade into the distance. "Dad?" Danny's voice was small and uncertain. "Yeah, buddy? Did we just make a really big mistake?" Ray put his arm around his son's shoulders and pulled him close, breathing in the familiar scent of motor oil and the indefinable essence of someone he loved beyond measure. "I honestly don't know." 3 days passed like a held breath. Ray threw himself into work with the desperate intensity of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts. But the garage felt hollow without Vivien's questions, and Danny's increasingly subdued responses to her absence. The Camaro received more attention than any car in the shop's history. Ray adjusted and readjusted components that were already perfect, polished surfaces that gleamed like mirrors, and documented maintenance that wouldn't be needed. For another 10,000 miles, Danny's distress manifested in subtle changes to his routines. His tool organization became more obsessive, his parts inventory more meticulously detailed, his conversation more sparse. He performed his tasks with mechanical precision, but without the joy that usually characterized his work. Ray recognized the signs his son was processing grief the only way he knew how, by controlling the controllable and hoping order would eventually restore emotional equilibrium. She's been sitting in her car at the overlook on Highway 9 for 2 days, Mrs. Chun announced Wednesday morning, arriving with a plate of apple turnovers and the kind of direct observation that small towns specialized in. That pretty little Mustang just parked there from dawn to dusk, like she's trying to decide something important. Ray looked up from the engine he was rebuilding, a 1969 Chevelle SS that belonged to a customer in the next county. Maybe she's enjoying the scenery. Ray Jensen, I've known you since you were 12 years old, and I've never seen you act this stubborn about something this important. Mrs. Chun settled onto one of the milk crates with the determination of someone preparing for a lengthy conversation. That woman didn't break your heart maliciously, and you know it. She lied to us, Mrs. Chun. For 3 weeks, she let us believe she was someone she wasn't. She was exactly who she appeared to be, a lonely woman who found something here worth staying for. The only difference is that she had more money than you realized and a complicated reason for showing up in the first place. Ray set down his wrench, recognizing that Mrs. Chun wouldn't be deterred by his pretense of being too busy to talk. It's not about the money. Of course it's about the money. Not because you're greedy, but because you're proud. You think accepting her help somehow diminishes what you've accomplished on your own. I think honesty matters in relationships. So does forgiveness, and timing, and recognizing when someone is trying to do the right thing, even if they go about it clumsily. Danny appeared from the office, carrying his clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who'd been listening to the conversation while pretending to work. Mrs. Chun, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. If someone helps you because they care about you, but they don't tell you they're helping, is that still a good thing? Mrs. Chun smiled at the question's directness. What do you think? I think it depends on why they didn't tell you. If they were trying to trick you, that's bad. But if they were trying to protect your feelings, or they were scared you'd be mad, that might be different. Very wise. What else do you think? Danny consulted his clipboard, though Ray suspected the answer wasn't written there. I think Ms. Hale was scared. She liked us, but she thought we might not like her if we knew about the investigation. So she kept postponing telling us until it got too complicated to explain. That sounds about right to me, Mrs. Chun agreed. What do you think, Ray? Ray felt the familiar frustration of being managed by people who cared about him. I think it's more complicated than either of you are making it sound. Or maybe it's simpler than you're making it sound, Mrs. Chun countered. Sometimes when we're scared of getting hurt again, we look for reasons to push away people who might matter to us. The observation hit closer to truth than Ray wanted to acknowledge. For 3 years, he'd built a life around emotional safety, predictable routines, manageable relationships, controlled environments where loss couldn't ambush him again. Vivian's presence had challenged all of that, and her deception had provided a convenient excuse to retreat to familiar isolation. She's probably better off without us complicating her life, Ray said. Oh, honey. Mrs. Chun's voice carried the gentle exasperation of someone watching a friend make a predictable mistake. Have you seen yourself these past 3 weeks? You've been happier than I've witnessed since before Sarah got sick. Danny's been practically glowing with the pleasure of having someone new to teach. And that woman looked at both of you like you'd hung the moon. Ray wanted to argue, but Mrs. Chun's observations were too accurate to dismiss. He had been happier, not because his grief had disappeared, but because Vivian's presence had reminded him that joy and loss could coexist, that honoring Sarah's memory didn't require abandoning possibilities for future connection. What am I supposed to do? Drive up to the overlook and pretend the last 3 days didn't happen? You're supposed to go talk to her like the adult you are, instead of sulking like a teenager who got his feelings hurt. Tom Bradley's truck rumbled into the garage yard, providing a temporary reprieve from Mrs. Chun's relationship counseling. Tom climbed down from the cab with his usual deliberate movements, but his expression carried unusual gravity. "Ray, we need to talk," he said without his customary greeting. "What's wrong?" "Ran into Vivian Hale at Murphy's Diner this morning. She was having coffee and looking like someone who'd been crying for days." Tom paused, choosing his words carefully. "She asked me to give you this." He held out an envelope with Ray's name written in Vivian's careful handwriting. The paper was expensive stationery, the kind that suggested formal correspondence rather than casual communication. Ray accepted the envelope with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Did she say anything else?" "Said to tell you that some mistakes can't be fixed, but she wanted you to understand her intentions, even if you couldn't forgive her methods." Mrs. Chun and Danny had moved closer, their attention focused on the envelope as if it contained answers to questions that had been troubling them all. "Are you going to open it?" Danny asked. Ray stared at the envelope, feeling the weight of whatever words Vivian had chosen to put on paper. "Maybe later." "Maybe now," Mrs. Chun suggested firmly. "In my experience, postponing difficult conversations only makes them more difficult." Ray tore open the envelope and unfolded 2 pages of handwritten text. Vivian's penmanship was elegant but hurried, as if she'd been trying to capture thoughts before they escaped. "Dear Ray and Danny," he read aloud, then stopped. "I don't know if I should read it," Danny said. If she wanted it to be private, she would have said so. Ray cleared his throat and began again. "Dear Ray and Danny, I've been sitting in my car for 2 days, trying to find words that might repair the damage I've caused, but some mistakes resist easy solutions. I realize now that my good intentions don't excuse my poor judgment, and my fear of rejection doesn't justify my deception. Came to your town because I was lost, not physically, but in every way that matters. I'd built a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt empty from within. Reading about Sarah's memorial garden was the first time in years that I'd encountered people who were using their grief to create something beautiful rather than letting it destroy them. I hired an investigator because I've learned to be cautious about people's motivations, especially when large amounts of money are involved. What I discovered was a family dealing with impossible financial pressures while maintaining dignity, grace, and genuine care for their community. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how to offer assistance without insulting your independence. Car trouble was real, but I won't pretend it was entirely coincidental. I'd been driving around your area for hours, trying to work up courage to approach you directly about the garden project. When the alternator failed, it felt like fate providing an opportunity I'd been too nervous to create for myself. Everything that happened after that was genuine. My interest in learning about restoration, my enjoyment of your company, my growing care for both of you, none of that was calculated or false. I fell in love with your way of life, with the honest work, and genuine relationships that had become foreign concepts in my world. I paid your medical bills because $47,000 means nothing to me financially, but everything to you practically. I know that sounds presumptuous, but I've spent enough years managing wealth to understand the difference between money that matters and money that doesn't. What I failed to understand was how much the deception would matter when you discovered it. Should have told you the truth after our first week together, when I realized that I cared about you as people rather than as a project. I should have trusted that your kindness was genuine enough to handle honesty, even complicated honesty. Instead, I let fear make my decisions, and I turned what could have been a gift into what feels like betrayal. I'm not asking for forgiveness, because I understand that trust, once broken, is difficult to repair. I'm asking you to believe that my feelings for both of you were real, that the time we spent together meant more to me than any other experience I've had in years. Danny, you taught me that wisdom and kindness matter more than conventional intelligence, and that patience is a form of love. You reminded me that good work is its own reward, and that attention to detail reflects respect for the people who will benefit from your efforts. Ray, You showed me what it means to build a life around values rather than ambitions, to find meaning in daily acts of care and competence. You demonstrated that grief and joy can coexist, that honoring the past doesn't require abandoning hope for the future. I'm staying at the Overlook for a few more days, trying to decide what comes next, not because I'm waiting for anything from you, but because leaving feels like another kind of abandonment. And I've abandoned too many things in my life already. Whatever you decide about me, please know that knowing both of you has been a privilege. I'll treasure for the rest of my life. With love and regret, Vivian. The garage fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic on the highway and the whispered conversations of birds in the trees Sarah had planted along the property line. Ray folded the letter carefully, his hands moving with the precision he brought to delicate mechanical work. She really cares about us, Danny said quietly. Yes, she does, Mrs. Chun agreed. And unless I'm much mistaken, you care about her too. Ray didn't answer immediately, but he walked to his workbench and opened the drawer where he kept important papers, warranties, certifications, and the few letters Sarah had written him during their courtship. He placed Vivian's letter among them, recognizing its significance, even if he wasn't ready to act on it. Tom, can you cover the shop for the rest of the day? Ray asked. Sure. Where are you going? Ray looked at Danny, who was watching him with hopeful attention. We're going home to finish a project I started a long time ago. The rocking chair had been waiting under its tarp like a patient reminder of interrupted intentions. Ray uncovered it with movements that felt ceremonial, revealing the smooth curves and careful joinery that represented months of evening work before Sarah's illness had demanded all his attention. It's beautiful, Dad, Danny said, running his hands along the armrests with the appreciation for craftsmanship he'd inherited from both parents. Your mother designed it. Every curve, every detail. She said it needed to be perfect for the grandchildren. We were going to spoil. Do you think we'll still have grandchildren someday? The question caught Ray off guard with its simple assumption that someday contained possibilities worth planning for. For 3 years, his future had felt like an extension of the present, more of the same, steady and predictable until the end. Danny's question suggested a different timeline, one where change and growth remained possible. I don't know, buddy. But your mother always said that hope is a decision you make, not a feeling you wait for. They worked together through the afternoon, Ray applying the final coat of finish, while Danny organized the hardware that would complete the assembly. The rhythmic motions of sanding and polishing were meditative, requiring enough attention to quiet anxious thoughts while leaving space for reflection. Dad, Danny said as the sun began to set behind the trees, do you think Mom would want you to be happy again? Ray set down his sandpaper and looked at his son, this gentle, thoughtful man who'd inherited Sarah's emotional intelligence, along with her stubborn commitment to seeing the best in people. What do you think? I think she'd want you to remember that love is something you give, not something you lose. And I think she'd like Miss Hale. Why? Because Miss Hale made you laugh again. Because she listened to me explain things without getting bored. Because she cared about Mom's garden, even though she never met her. Danny paused, organizing his thoughts with characteristic care. And because she left when you asked her to, even though it made her sad. That's what people do when they really love someone. They respect what you need, even when it's not what they want. Ray felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening after being locked for years. Danny was right about Sarah's likely approval, about Vivian's genuine care, about the difference between protecting himself and punishing someone who tried to love him imperfectly. What do you think I should do? I think you should finish Mom's chair and then go talk to Miss Hale. I think you should bring her something that shows you understand why she stayed away. Like what? Danny smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd been thinking about this problem for days. Like one of Mom's letters. Ray found the letters where he'd kept them since Sarah's death, a shoebox in his bedroom closet, filled with Notes she'd written during their 25 years together. Love letters from their courtship. Thank you cards from anniversaries. And the final letter she'd written when she knew time was running short. The letter Danny had suggested was the last one Sarah had written, sealed in an envelope marked for Ray, when you're ready to love again. He'd never been able to bring himself to open it, afraid that reading her words would feel like receiving permission he wasn't ready to accept. Now, sitting in his bedroom with the finished rocking chair visible through the window and the memory of Vivian's tears fresh in his mind, Ray broke the seal and unfolded his wife's final gift. My dearest Ray, she'd written in the careful handwriting that had grown shakier near the end. If you're reading this, it means you found someone worth caring about again, and I couldn't be happier. The letter continued for 2 pages, full of Sarah's characteristic wisdom and her absolute conviction that love was meant to be shared, not hoarded. She wrote about the future she wouldn't see, but could still help shape, about her hopes for Ray and Danny's continued happiness, and about her certainty that the heart had infinite capacity for love, if people were brave enough to use it. Don't let fear make your decisions, she'd concluded. And don't let my absence become an excuse to avoid the risks that make life worth living. Love whoever deserves your love, as fully as you loved me. That's how you honor what we built together, by building something new when the right person comes along. Ray folded the letter carefully and looked out the window toward the highway, where Vivian was probably still sitting in her father's car, trying to decide what came next. He thought about the rocking chair Sarah had designed for grandchildren they might still have someday, about Danny's simple faith in love's possibilities, and about the woman who'd accidentally reminded him that contentment and happiness were different things. Danny, he called toward the kitchen, where his son was making their simple dinner. How would you feel about taking a drive? The overlook on Highway 9 was exactly where Mrs. Chand had said it would be. Scenic pullout that offered views of the valley where their small town nestled among rolling hills. Vivian's midnight blue Mustang sat at the far end of the gravel area, positioned so its occupant could watch the sun set behind the distant mountains. Ray parked his truck a respectful distance away, close enough to signal his presence, but far enough to avoid seeming presumptuous. Through the Mustang's rear window, he could see Vivian's silhouette, motionless as a statue. She's really here, Danny said quietly, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell that had brought them this far. She's really here, Ray confirmed, though now that the moment had arrived, he felt the familiar paralysis of not knowing what words could possibly bridge the gap between understanding and forgiveness. Are you nervous? Danny asked, terrified. That's probably good. Mom always said that important things should make you nervous, because that's how you know they matter. Ray looked at his son, marveling once again at the wisdom that emerged from Danny's unfiltered observations about human behavior. When did you get so smart about relationships? I watch people carefully, and I remember everything Mom taught me about love being brave enough to be vulnerable. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the sky cycle through shades of orange and pink as the sun approached the horizon. Ray had Sarah's letter in his shirt pocket, its weight both comforting and challenging, a reminder that love required action, not just intention. Dad? Danny's voice carried the careful tone he used when broaching sensitive subjects. What if she doesn't want to talk to us? Then we respect that and leave. But at least we'll have tried. And what if she does want to talk, but you can't think of what to say? Ray smiled despite his nervousness. Then I'll probably start with, I'm sorry, and see where that leads. That sounds like a good plan. Taking a deep breath that tasted of evening air and possibilities, Ray opened his truck door. Want to come with me? I think this conversation should probably start with just you, but I'll be right here if you need backup. Ray approached the Mustang with the careful steps of someone trying not to startle a wild animal. When he reached the driver's side window, He tapped gently on the glass and waited for Vivien to decide whether she wanted to acknowledge his presence. The window rolled down slowly, revealing a face that showed the evidence of several days' worth of tears and sleepless nights. But when Vivien saw him, something shifted in her expression. Not quite hope, but the cautious recognition of an unexpected possibility. "Hello, Ray." "Hello, Vivien. Mind if I join you?" She gestured toward the passenger seat, and Ray walked around the car with movements that felt significant, as if crossing from one side of the Mustang to the other represented a journey from isolation to connection. The car's interior smelled like leather and the faint perfume Vivien wore, scents that had become familiar during their weeks working together. Ray settled into the passenger seat, noting how the car fit him perfectly. James Hawley had been a similar size, and his restoration work had included adjusting the seat positioning for optimal comfort. "Beautiful view," Ray said, looking out at the valley, where lights were beginning to twinkle in windows as families gathered for evening meals. "I've been sitting here, trying to understand how my life got so complicated," Vivien replied. 3 weeks ago, I had a clear sense of who I was and what I was supposed to be doing. Now, I feel like I don't know anything. Change has a way of doing that. Sarah used to say that growth is just another word for controlled destruction. You have to let go of who you were before you can become who you're supposed to be. They sat quietly for a moment, both watching the sun's descent toward the horizon. The silence felt different than it had 3 days ago, less charged with anger, more weighted with the possibility of understanding. "I brought you something," Ray said, reaching into his shirt pocket. "A letter Sarah wrote before she died. I thought you might want to read it." Vivien accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. "Are you sure? This seems very personal." "It is personal, but it's also relevant to our situation." Vivien unfolded the letter carefully, her eyes moving across Sarah's handwriting, with the attention of someone who understood she was being entrusted with something precious. Ray watched her face as she read, seeing emotions cycle through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been relief. "She was remarkable," Vivien said when she finished, refolding the letter with the same care she'd used to open it. "She was. And she was usually right about things that mattered. What she wrote about love having infinite capacity. I think she understood something I've spent my whole life learning the hard way." "Which is?" "That caring about people isn't a limited resource. Loving someone new doesn't diminish what you felt for someone else. It just means your heart got bigger." Ray felt something loosen in his chest at her words, the recognition that she understood the complexity of loving while grieving, of honoring the past while remaining open to the future. "I owe you an apology," Ray said. "Not for being hurt by the deception, but for not giving you a chance to explain properly. I was scared, so I reacted defensively instead of trying to understand your perspective." "You don't owe me anything, Ray. I created this situation by handling it badly from the beginning. Maybe we both made mistakes, but that doesn't mean we can't figure out how to move forward." Vivien turned to look at him directly, her eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. "What kind of moving forward did you have in mind?" "I don't know yet, but I know that these past few days without you have felt wrong. Danny's been miserable. I've been miserable. And Mrs. Chun has been lecturing both of us about throwing away something good because we're too proud to forgive each other." A small smile touched the corners of Vivien's mouth. "Mrs. Chun sounds like a wise woman." "She is, and she pointed out that your mistake came from caring too much rather than too little. That seems worth considering." "I do care, Ray, more than I've cared about anything in years. But I understand if the trust is too damaged to repair." Ray was quiet for a moment, thinking about trust and its relationship to risk, about the difference between being careful and being afraid. "Danny asked me what I thought Sarah would want," he said finally, "and I realized she'd want me to be brave enough to love someone who deserves it, even if loving them meant accepting some uncertainty about the future. And I think you deserve it, Vivien." Not because you're perfect, but because you're genuine in the ways that matter. You care about people. You're willing to learn. You made Danny feel valued for who he is, and you brought joy back into my life when I'd forgotten what that felt like. Vivian's eyes filled with tears, but they seemed like tears of relief rather than sadness. I don't know how to do this. Ray, I've never been in a relationship where someone knew me well enough to forgive my mistakes. Then we'll figure it out together. One day at a time, like everything else worth doing. The sun had disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and gold. In the gathering darkness, the lights of their small town looked like scattered stars, marking places where people had built lives worth coming home to. Ray? Vivian's voice was soft with possibility. Would you like to have dinner tomorrow night? Somewhere we can talk about what comes next. I'd like that very much. But first, there's something I want to show you. What? Ray smiled, thinking about the rocking chair waiting in his workshop, and the future it represented uncertain, but full of promise. A project I finally finished. One that I think you'll appreciate. The wooden heart fit perfectly in Ray's palm, its surface smooth from hours of careful sanding, and its grain highlighted by multiple coats of oil that brought out the natural beauty of the oak. He'd carved it during the 3 days after Vivian left, working late into the evenings when sleep seemed impossible and his hands needed something to do besides replay their conversations. I made this for you, Ray said, holding out the small sculpture as Vivian stepped into his workshop. It's from the same wood as Sarah's rocking chair, the project I finally finished. Vivian accepted the gift with the reverence of someone who understood that handmade objects carried more than aesthetic value. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of the wood and the precision of the carving that had shaped it. It's beautiful, Ray, but are you sure you want me to have something made from Sarah's chair? I'm sure. The wood came from lumber. We bought together, but she always said that materials were meant to be used for creating things that mattered. This matters. Vivian's eyes filled with tears as she traced the heart's curves with her fair fingertip. What does it mean? It means I'm willing to try. To trust that what we built together was real, even though it started under complicated circumstances. To believe that love is something you choose to give, not something you lose when you risk caring about someone new. They stood in the workshop surrounded by Ray's tools and half-finished projects, the rocking chair visible in the background, like a promise of possibilities still taking shape. The space smelled of sawdust and oil finish, honest scents that reflected the patient work of someone who understood that beautiful things required time and attention to create properly. Ray, I need you to understand something, Vivian said, her voice steady despite the tears. I'm not just asking you to forgive a mistake. I'm asking you to accept that my life is complicated in ways that might affect both of you. What kind of complications? I have a foundation worth $200 million, a board of directors who think I've lost my mind, business interests that span 3 continents, and family obligations that require me to make decisions about things I don't always understand. Vivian paused, organizing her thoughts with the care she'd learned from watching Danny approach complex problems. I can't just walk away from all of that, even if I wanted to. I'm not asking you to walk away from anything. I'm asking if there's room in that complicated life for us. There's room, but it would mean changes for everyone, you, me, and Danny. I can't become someone I'm not, and I wouldn't ask you to either. But maybe we can figure out how to blend our different worlds in ways that work for all of us. Ray moved closer to her, close enough to see the gold flecks in her eyes and the fine lines that marked 6 decades of experience. What would that look like? I don't know yet. Maybe it means I relocate the foundation's operations here, where I can be more directly involved in projects like Sarah's garden. Maybe it means you and Danny help me figure out how to do philanthropy that actually connects with people instead of just writing checks. Maybe it means we build something new together, a business, a family, A way of life that honors what we've both learned about what matters. And if it doesn't work? If we try to blend our worlds and discover they're too different to reconcile? Vivien was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then we'll have tried something brave and worthwhile, even if it didn't work out perfectly. That's better than spending the rest of our lives wondering what might have been possible. Ray reached out and touched her face gently, his calloused thumb wiping away a tear that had escaped despite her attempts to stay composed. Sarah used to say that the best decisions are the ones that scare you a little because they matter so much. Is this scaring you? Terrifying me. But in a good way, the way you feel before you start a restoration project. You're not sure you're skilled enough to complete. Vivien smiled through her tears. And what makes you think we have the skills to restore whatever this is between us? Because we both know how to be patient with complicated problems. Because we both care more about doing things right than doing them quickly. And because we've already proven we work well together, even when we don't have all the information we need. The workshop door opened, and Danny appeared with his characteristic careful entrance into emotional situations. Dad, is everything okay? Everything's fine, buddy. Actually, everything's better than fine. Danny looked between his father and Vivien, taking in their proximity and the wooden heart she still held in her hands. His face lit up with the kind of joy that comes from seeing something important finally fall into place. Ms. Hale, are you staying? I'd like to, if you and your father will have me. Not just visiting, but really staying, building a life here that includes both of you. Danny clapped his hands together with uncharacteristic exuberance. That's the best news I've heard in weeks. Does this mean you'll keep learning about cars? And that you'll help with Mom's garden? And that Dad will smile the way he used to? I think it means all of those things, Vivien said, laughing despite her tears. And probably some things we haven't thought of yet. Ray watched his son's excitement and felt something settle into place in his chest. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of hope, strong enough to coexist with loss. This wasn't about replacing what he'd had with Sarah, but about adding something new and valuable to the life they'd built together. There's something else, Ray said, reaching into his pocket for the small velvet box he'd been carrying since leaving the house. This belonged to Sarah, but she left instructions about what to do with it when the time was right. Vivien's eyes widened as Ray opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a modest diamond, not flashy or expensive, but chosen with care and worn with love for 25 years. Sarah wanted this to go to someone who would understand its value, Ray said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was offering. Someone who knew that love is about partnership and commitment and the willingness to show up for each other every day, even when it's difficult. Ray, are you... I'm asking if you'll marry me, Vivien. Not because I'm trying to replace what I lost, but because I want to build something new with someone I love. Because you make me happy, and you're good for Danny, and you understand what it means to care about work that matters. Vivien stared at the ring, then at Ray, then at Danny, who was practically vibrating with excitement. This is very sudden. The proposal is sudden. The feelings behind it have been growing for weeks. What if I'm not good at being married? What if I'm too set in my ways or too used to making decisions independently? Then we'll figure it out, together, the same way we figured out how to restore your father's car. One step at a time, with patience and attention to detail. Danny had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention he brought to all important conversations. Ms. Hale, can I say something? Of course. Marriage isn't about being perfect. It's about finding someone you want to practice being better with. Dad and Mom taught me that. And I think you and Dad would be good practice partners for each other. Vivien laughed, a sound that carried relief and joy in the recognition that sometimes the most important decisions feel both terrifying and inevitable. Yes, she said simply. Yes to marriage. Yes to building something new together. Yes to practicing being better with both of you. Ray slipped Sarah's ring onto Vivian's finger with hands that were completely steady, watching as the gold caught the workshop's overhead light and seemed to glow with approval. The fit was perfect, as if the ring had been waiting for the right person to come along and give it new purpose. Danny stepped forward and hugged them both simultaneously, his arms encircling the three of them in an embrace that felt like a blessing and a beginning. Mom would have liked this, he said quietly. She would have liked knowing that love found a way to grow bigger instead of smaller. Standing in the workshop where he'd built so many things with his hands, surrounded by tools and projects and the evidence of patient craftsmanship, Ray understood that some restorations were about more than returning objects to their original condition. Sometimes the best work involved taking something that had been damaged and making it into something new, different than before, but stronger for having been carefully rebuilt with love and attention to what mattered most. The wooden heart sat on the workbench where Vivian had placed it, catching the light like a promise that beautiful things could emerge from ordinary materials when they were shaped by skilled hands and genuine care. Tomorrow there would be details to work out, plans to make, logistics to navigate. But tonight there was this: 3 people who'd found each other despite impossible odds, ready to build something lasting together. 6 months later, the sign outside the garage read, Jensen and Hale Classic Restorations, in letters that Danny had helped design and Ray had carefully painted during the warm afternoons of late summer. The business had expanded into the adjoining building, creating space for the automotive restoration classes that had become surprisingly popular among local teenagers and retirees who wanted to learn skills their grandfathers had taken for granted. Vivian stood in the doorway of their new office, watching Ray demonstrate proper torque wrench technique to a group of students that included 2 high school seniors, a retired banker, and Mrs. Patterson from the bed and breakfast. His teaching style had evolved naturally from his work with Danny patient, clear and focused on understanding principles rather than simply memorizing procedures. The goal isn't just to tighten the bolt, Ray was explaining. It's to create the right amount of tension for the specific application. Too little, and the joint will fail under stress. Too much, and you'll strip the threads or crack the component. Precision matters because someone's safety depends on getting it right. Danny moved among the students with his clipboard and natural teaching ability, offering individual guidance and answering questions with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found his calling. The automotive program had been his idea, way to share his organizational skills and encyclopedic knowledge while providing meaningful work for young adults who learn differently than their peers. How's the foundation transition going? Ray asked during their lunch break, settling onto one of the milk crates that had become traditional seating in the expanded garage. Better than expected. The board initially resisted the relocation, but the results speak for themselves. Vivian consulted her tablet, where she tracked the metrics that had become her new obsession. Direct impact projects have increased by 400% since we moved operations here. When you're actually in the communities you're trying to help, it turns out you make better decisions about what help is needed. And they're okay with the career change from billionaire philanthropist to automotive instructor? Vivian laughed, gesturing toward her coveralls and the grease stains that had become permanent features under her fingernails. I think they've accepted that I'm happier teaching teenagers how to rebuild carburetors than I ever was sitting in. Boardrooms arguing about portfolio diversification. The afternoon brought Tom Bradley's weekly parts delivery, his ancient truck rattling into the yard with its customary symphony of mechanical complaints. But today he wasn't alone. A sleek sedan followed him into the parking area, and Vivian recognized the careful movements of her former board chairman as he emerged from the passenger seat. Trouble? Ray asked quietly, noting the tension in Vivian's shoulders. Probably. Harrison Webb doesn't make social calls. Webb approached the garage with the cautious steps of someone entering unfamiliar territory. his expensive suit and polished shoes marking him as clearly out of place among the oil stains and automotive equipment. He nodded politely to Ray and Danny before addressing Vivien with formal courtesy. "Vivien, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but there are matters requiring your attention." "What kind of matters, Harrison?" "The African Water Project has received a significant matching grant, contingent on your personal oversight. The donor specifically requested your involvement, citing the Foundation's improved community engagement since your relocation." Vivien exchanged glances with Ray, reading the question in his expression. They'd talked about this possibility requests. That would require to travel, obligations that couldn't be delegated to staff. How much oversight, and for how long? 6 weeks, perhaps 2 months. The project is in rural Kenya, and the infrastructure challenges are considerable. Danny had been listening with the focused attention he brought to all important conversations. "Ms. Hale, is this the kind of work you used to do before you came here?" "Similar, but more hands-on. This would involve working directly with the communities to design and implement clean water systems." "That sounds important." "It is important, but it would mean leaving for several weeks, and the timing isn't ideal with the teaching program just getting established." Ray stood and brushed the dust from his hands, a gesture Vivien had learned to recognize as his way of organizing his thoughts before speaking. "How important is this project?" "Very important. The grant could fund clean water access for 15,000 people. Then you should go." Vivien felt something tighten in her chest at his immediate response. "Just like that?" "Just like that. This is exactly the kind of work you're meant to be doing, using your expertise and resources to help people who need it most. Danny and I can handle things here for a couple months. But the classes, the restoration projects, will be here when you get back. And maybe you'll come home with new ideas about how to expand what we're doing." Harrison had been observing this exchange with obvious surprise, clearly not expecting such easy resolution to what he'd anticipated would be a difficult negotiation. "There's one more thing," he said carefully. "The donor has specifically requested that your husband accompany you. Apparently, they've heard about the Foundation's new focus on hands-on technical education and want to discuss expanding similar programs internationally." Ray and Vivien looked at each other, recognizing the opportunity being presented. They'd been married for 3 months, but their honeymoon had been postponed due to the Foundation's relocation and the expansion of the garage business. "What do you think?" Vivien asked. "Ready for an African adventure?" "I think Sarah would have loved the idea of her memorial garden inspiring clean water projects in Kenya." Danny clapped his hands together with excitement. "This is perfect. You can help people get clean water, and Dad can teach them about maintaining the systems, and I can run the garage while you're gone." "By yourself?" Ray asked, though his concern was tempered by pride in his son's growing confidence. "Mrs. Chon already said she'd help with the office work, and Tom can handle any major repairs. I'll just focus on the classes and basic maintenance. It'll be good practice for when you officially make me a partner." Ray felt his eyebrows rise at this announcement. "When did we discuss making you a partner?" "We didn't, but I've been thinking about it, and it makes sense. I know the business as well as you do. The students respect me, and I'm ready for more responsibility." Vivien smiled at Danny's matter-of-fact approach to career advancement. "He's right. You." "No. He's been essentially running the educational program since we started. Partnership comes with a lot of responsibility, buddy." "Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I'm sure. Mom always said I'd surprise people with what I could accomplish. I think it's time to start surprising them." Ray looked at his son, this thoughtful, capable man who'd grown from the frightened child he'd once worried about into someone ready to take on the world with confidence and competence. Sarah had been right about the surprises Danny would provide. "All right, then. We'll make it official when we get back from Africa. Jensen, Hale, and Jensen Classic Restorations." Actually, Danny said with a grin, I was thinking more like Jensen and Associates. It sounds more professional. Later that evening, after Harrison had departed with promises to arrange travel details, and Tom had delivered the last of his weekly part shipment, Ray and Vivien sat in Sarah's garden, watching the sun set behind the mountains that framed their valley. The rocking chair Ray had finally completed occupied a place of honor on the porch, waiting for the grandchildren they might someday have, biological or adopted or simply borrowed from friends who needed extra hands for childcare. Are you nervous about leaving Danny in charge? Vivien asked, her head resting against Ray's shoulder as they shared the garden bench she'd built during their engagement. A little, but mostly I'm proud of him. He's become the man Sarah always believed he could be. And what about us? Are you nervous about spending 2 months in Africa together, working on a project that will test every skill we've developed? Ray considered the question seriously. Marriage had taught him that honesty about uncertainties was just as important as confidence about commitments. I'm nervous about the work. Clean water systems are more complicated than carburetors. But I'm not nervous about doing it with you. We're good partners, Vivien. In the garage, in the foundation work, in figuring out how to build a life that honors the past while embracing the future. Even when I make decisions that complicate everything, especially then. Sarah used to say that the best adventures happen when you're brave enough to say yes to opportunities that scare you a little. They sat in comfortable silence as the evening light faded and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The garden around them showed the results of their combined care. Sarah's original design, enhanced by Vivien's systematic approach to soil improvement, and Ray's patient attention to the details that kept everything thriving. Ray, Vivien's voice, carried the thoughtful tone that usually preceded important observations. I think I understand now what your mother-in-law meant about love having infinite capacity. How so? I love you differently than I've ever loved anyone, but it doesn't diminish what I felt for my father or what you felt for Sarah. It's like adding new rooms to a house. The original structure stays the same, but there's more space for life to happen. Ray pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair mixed with the evening fragrance of honeysuckle and roses. I think Sarah would have liked that analogy. She was always talking about love as construction rather than consumption. Do you think she would have approved of us? Ray was quiet for a moment, thinking about his wife's generous spirit and her absolute conviction that love was meant to be shared rather than hoarded. I think she would have been thrilled that you helped me remember how to be happy again. And I think she would have loved seeing Danny flourish the way he has since you've been part of our lives. A month later, they stood in the departure lounge of the international airport, surrounded by luggage that contained everything from water purification equipment to Ray's portable toolkit. Danny had driven them to the city, his confidence behind the wheel matched by his excitement about managing the business independently. Remember to check the oil in the Camaro every week, Ray said, running through the mental checklist he'd been developing for days. Dad, I've been checking oil since I was 12. The cars will be fine. And don't let the students use the hydraulic lift without supervision. Ray, Vivien interrupted gently. He's got this. We've trained him well, and Mrs. Chung will keep an eye on everything. I know, it's just the first time you've left him completely in charge of something this important, Danny finished. I understand, Dad, but I'm ready. And you're ready too, even if you don't feel like it. Ray hugged his son, feeling the solid strength of the man he'd become and the quiet confidence that had grown from years of patient encouragement and meaningful responsibility. We're proud of you, buddy. Your mom would be proud too. She is proud, and she's excited about the adventure you're going on. As their flight was called, Ray and Vivien gathered their carry-on bags and prepared to embark on the next chapter of their unexpected partnership. The water project would be challenging. requiring every skill they'd developed in automotive restoration and small-town problem-solving. But they'd learned to work well together under pressure, to trust each other's expertise, and to find solutions. That honored both practical necessities and human dignity. "Ready for this?" Vivian asked as they walked toward the boarding gate. Ray thought about the journey that had brought them here, from the day her Mustang had broken down outside his garage, to this moment when they were heading to Africa as partners in marriage, business, and purpose. It hadn't been the life he'd planned, but it had become the life he chose, one decision at a time. "I'm ready," he said, taking her hand as they stepped toward whatever came next. "As long as we're doing it together." Behind them, through the airport's plate glass windows, their small town waited beneath the same stars that would shine on their work in Kenya. Danny was probably closing the garage for the day. Mrs. Chun was likely preparing tomorrow's coffee, and the students in their automotive program were perhaps practicing the skills that would serve them for decades to come. The future stretched ahead like an empty road, full of possibilities they couldn't yet imagine, but ready to embrace with the patience, skill, and love they'd learned from restoring broken things and making them beautiful again. Some adventures, Ray had discovered, were worth the risk of leaving everything familiar behind, especially when you had the right partner for the journey and the confidence that home would be waiting when you were ready to return.